In late 1944, German intelligence officers analyzing the Western Front faced a mathematical impossibility. According to their meticulously confirmed kill reports, the American 3rd Armored Division had been virtually wiped out, losing hundreds of Sherman tanks in grinding combat across northern Europe. By all standard military logic, the division should have ceased to exist, requiring months of withdrawal to rebuild. Yet within a matter of days, the Spearhead Division was back on the attack, operating at near full combat strength. This impossible resurrection shattered the rigid calculations of German intelligence, forcing a critical question that their high command completely failed to comprehend. The immediate assumption in Berlin was that their frontline panzer commanders were simply lying, exaggerating their kill counts to mask their own strategic retreats. But the battlefield evidence proved otherwise. The Germans were indeed destroying Sherman tanks at an alarming rate, turning European fields into graveyards of scorched armor. Yet the Americans were not relying on a sudden, magical convoy delivering entirely fresh divisions overnight to replace the fallen. The truth was far more systemic and, to the traditional German military mindset, deeply unnerving. It was a logistical leviathan functioning in the mud and cold just miles behind the front lines. The underlying conflict of the armored war had become a brutal equation. The sheer, devastating volume of battlefield destruction matched against the hidden, unglamorous mechanisms of the American supply chain. The real question facing the Axis was not simply how the United States managed to build so many machines in the safety of Detroit or Chrysler arsenals. They already knew the industrial capacity of America. The terrifying question was how the U.S. Army had perfected the ability to resurrect shattered armored units directly on the battlefield, patching the gaping holes in the 3rd Armored Division's roster almost as fast as German anti-tank guns could tear them open. It was an operational resilience that defied all known military doctrine. But this fluid, relentless system of regeneration was not born overnight, and it was never guaranteed to work. To understand how the Americans achieved this impossible resurrection, we must first look at the massive geographic bottleneck that threatened to choke the life out of the entire Allied advance long before the tanks ever reached the German frontier. That massive geographic bottleneck was the Atlantic Ocean, a vast, violent expanse of water stretching roughly 4,000 miles from the assembly lines of Michigan to the shattered docks of northern Europe. The sheer distance dictated every strategic decision the United States made regarding its armored forces. Unlike the German military, which could theoretically roll a newly manufactured Panther tank straight out of a factory in Stuttgart and onto a rail car bound directly for the front line, the American supply chain was brutally constrained by the physics of maritime transport. Every single piece of machinery, from a half-inch wrench to a 30-ton tank, had to be loaded onto a ship, transported across an ocean that had spent years infested with U-boats, and then painstakingly unloaded at the other end. Even by late 1944, when the submarine threat had been largely neutralized, shipping tonnage remained the single most precious commodity of the Allied war effort. Because of this rigid logistical reality, the American military could not design the heaviest, most heavily armored, or most heavily gunned tank in the world. They had to design a tank that could be shipped. The physical dimensions of the M4 Sherman were not dictated purely by battlefield requirements. They were dictated by the width of standard American railway tunnels and the lifting capacity of dockside cranes at ports like New York and Liverpool. The Sherman had to fit snugly into the cargo holds of Liberty ships. It had to be relatively easy to maintain, heavily standardized, and capable of operating thousands of miles away from its original point of manufacture. It was, in many ways, an engineering marvel of industrial pragmatism. But this pragmatism came with a steep, bloody cost on the battlefield. American armored doctrine, championed by high-ranking officers like Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, envisioned a highly mobile exploitation force. Tanks were supposed to act like traditional cavalry, breaking through weakened enemy lines, disrupting rear echelons, and destroying supply depots. According to this pre-war doctrine, the job of actually destroying enemy tanks was supposed to fall to specialized, fast-moving tank destroyer battalions. The Sherman was therefore built as a medium tank, armed primarily with a 75mm gun that was excellent for firing high-explosive shells at infantry and pillboxes, but fundamentally underpowered for piercing thick frontal armor. When the Allied armies finally broke out of the Normandy beachheads and pushed toward the German border, this theoretical doctrine violently collided with reality. The fast-moving exploitation battles U.S. commanders had trained for frequently devolved into brutal, static slugfests against deeply entrenched German defenders. The M4 Sherman suddenly found itself forced into direct, head-to-head confrontations with heavier German machines it was never specifically designed to duel. German Panthers, with their sloped frontal armor and devastating high-velocity 75mm guns, and the infamous Heavy Tigers, armed with the lethal 88mm cannon, completely outclassed the standard Sherman in a one-on-one frontal fight. Furthermore, the German infantry was heavily equipped with Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks, portable, shaped-charge anti-tank weapons that could easily punch through the Sherman's relatively thin side and rear armor from concealed positions in the European hedgerows and ruined villages. Consequently, high attrition was not an unexpected disaster. It was a mathematical certainty, fully anticipated by both sides. When a U.S. armored division like the 3rd, the Spearhead, engaged in sustained combat, the losses were staggering. A single afternoon of assaulting a fortified town or attempting to breach the concrete dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line could easily result in 20, 30, or even 50 Shermans left burning, disabled, or permanently destroyed in the mud. By traditional military logic, a unit suffering this level of equipment destruction would be considered combat ineffective. It would be forced to pull back, lick its wounds, and wait for wholesale replacements. This is exactly what German intelligence expected. They knew the operational strength of an American armored division stood at roughly 232 medium tanks. When their own frontline reports confirmed that they had knocked out half or even 3/4 of that number in a specific sector, they logically concluded that the American division in question was temporarily neutralized. But here lay the ultimate strategic dilemma for the Allied High Command. The entire American operational strategy in Western Europe relied entirely on relentless, suffocating momentum. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his field commanders, like Omar Bradley and George S. Patton, could not afford to give the Wehrmacht time to breathe, regroup, or reinforce their defensive lines. If the Americans paused their offensive every time an armored division took heavy losses, the war would grind to a static, bloody stalemate, favoring the entrenched defenders. The advance had to continue. The pressure had to be maintained, regardless of the daily butcher's bill of shattered armor. Yet, fulfilling this demand for momentum seemed physically impossible, due to the transatlantic bottleneck. When a division like the 3rd Armored was hollowed out by combat, the United States could not simply order a fresh, fully equipped armored division to sail across the ocean and take its place on the line the next morning. It took months to assemble, train, equip, and ship a combat-ready division. Even if the troops and tanks were available in the United States, the physical ports in Europe could not handle the influx. After the invasion, the Allies relied heavily on the captured port of Cherbourg and the temporary Mulberry harbors, which were operating far beyond their intended capacities, choked with the daily requirements of food, ammunition, and fuel, just to keep the existing armies alive. Even when the massive port of Antwerp was captured intact, it remained unusable for months until the Scheldt estuary was painfully cleared of German mines and coastal batteries late in the year. The logistical pipeline was simply too narrow and too long to constantly cycle entire divisions in and out of the combat zone. The space on the transport ships was fought over by quartermasters demanding artillery shells, medical supplies, aviation fuel, and infantry replacements to fill out depleted rifle companies. There was no room and no time to treat armored divisions as disposable, single-use formations that could be easily swapped out when their tanks were destroyed. The fragile nature of the Sherman tank against heavy German anti-tank defenses meant the armored units would inevitably bleed machines at a terrifying rate. Simultaneously, the vast distance of the Atlantic Ocean and the severely limited port capacities meant that massive, rapid infusions of entirely new replacement divisions were strategically impossible. The Allied command was caught between the urgent, non-negotiable need to maintain offensive pressure against fortified German lines and the grim reality that their primary instrument for that pressure was being rapidly chewed to pieces 4,000 miles away from the factories that built it. If the ocean was too wide, the ports too clogged, and the enemy too resilient to allow for the wholesale replacement of armored divisions from the United States, a completely different approach to maintaining combat power had to be invented. The Americans realized that if they could not bring enough new divisions across the water to replace the fallen, they had to figure out a way to magically regenerate the divisions they already had. The answer to the German mathematical puzzle couldn't wait for a ship to arrive from New York. It had to be forged immediately, right there on the continent, relying on a system that existed entirely in the shadows of the front line. The paradigm shift began not with combat troops, but with mechanics. To solve the crisis of transatlantic logistics, the United States Army deployed an entirely new kind of battlefield asset, the Heavy Ordnance Maintenance Battalion. While the Wehrmacht often left their immobilized Panthers and Tigers to rust in the fields, or waited for specialized rail transport to haul them back to distant factory hubs deep inside the Reich, the Americans chose the exact opposite approach. If they could not ship enough new tanks across the ocean, they would simply bring the industrial power of Detroit directly to the mud of the front line. It started with the brutal reality of battlefield recovery. In the American system, a knocked-out M4 Sherman was rarely written off as a total loss. It was immediately viewed as a critical, salvageable asset. To retrieve these multi-ton metal corpses, the Army utilized specialized, heavily modified machines like the M32 tank recovery vehicle. Built on a Sherman chassis but stripped of its main turret, the M32 was fitted with a massive A-frame crane, a fixed mortar for laying smoke screens, and a powerful 60,000-pound winch. But recovering a crippled tank was never a simple towing job. These machines were usually destroyed in the exact kill zones that had just halted the American advance. Ordnance recovery crews, who were technically rear echelon mechanics in greasy overalls, not frontline infantrymen, frequently had to drive their M32s directly into contested territory. Operating under active German artillery barrages, mortar fire, or the sights of concealed anti-tank guns, these men had to dismount, crawl through the churning mud, and manually attach heavy steel towing cables to the shattered, sometimes still smoldering hulls of disabled tanks. It was a terrifying, highly lethal assignment. The extreme danger of recovering a multi-ton metal wreck under incoming high-explosive fire constantly clashed with the desperate, overarching need for operational armor. The sheer physical resistance of dragging a dead, 30-ton piece of steel out of a deep ditch, a blasted hedgerow, or a ruined street required immense mechanical torque and ice-cold nerves from the recovery teams. The Germans often watched these operations with disbelief. To their rigid military doctrine, risking specialized personnel and equipment to drag a heavily damaged medium tank out of a crossfire seemed absurd. Yet the Americans did it relentlessly. Once hooked up, the wrecks were dragged mere miles behind the active fighting, pulled just out of range of direct enemy observation into makeshift encampments hidden in French farmyards, ruined industrial parks, or Belgian forests. Here, the landscape abruptly transformed into a surreal pop-up industrial zone. Canvas tents shielded portable generators, massive air compressors, and heavy welding equipment. Ordnance mechanics worked around the clock in the pouring rain and freezing cold. They used the M32's heavy cranes to lift entire turrets off ruined chassis right there in the dirt. They were executing heavy, factory-level structural engineering in an active war zone, cutting away jagged, blasted armor plating with oxyacetylene torches, and hammering out bent suspensions. The German High Command, bound by centralized logistical doctrines that required sending damaged heavy armor back to the factory, simply couldn't fathom this level of decentralized, heavy industrial repair happening virtually within sight of the front lines. It was a logistical agility they did not possess and could not anticipate. But surviving the terrifying recovery under fire and hauling a shattered tank back to these mud-soaked field depots was only half the battle. Dragging a ruined machine off the field saved the steel, but the true, terrifying miracle that broke German intelligence calculations was how impossibly fast that dead machine returned to the fight. The secret to this resurrected armor was baked into the very blueprints of the M4 Sherman years before it ever saw combat. The American military establishment did not view the tank as a bespoke, handcrafted weapon of war. They viewed it as an industrial appliance, subject to the exact same ruthless standardization as a commercial delivery truck or a factory generator. When a German Panther tank suffered a catastrophic transmission failure in the field, replacing it was an engineering nightmare. The Panther's over-engineered, interlocking road wheels had to be painstakingly removed, and the heavy turret often had to be lifted by specialized gantry cranes just to access the internal hull compartments, forcing the vehicle out of action for days, if not weeks, usually far behind the lines. The Sherman, by stark contrast, was designed for the mechanics in the mud. Its transmission and final drive were bolted directly to the massive, single-piece cast steel nose of the tank. If an armor-piercing shell shattered the transmission but left the rest of the vehicle structurally intact, an American Ordnance crew didn't need to dismantle the entire tank. Using the heavy A-frame crane of their M32 recovery vehicle, they simply unbolted the entire front armored housing, pulled the shattered transmission out as a single modular unit, and dropped a fresh one into place. A highly trained maintenance battalion could perform this massive organ transplant in a matter of hours, under the cover of darkness, in a rain-soaked French orchard. Every single bolt, track pin, road wheel, and engine component across thousands of Shermans was universally interchangeable. There was no need for custom-machined fittings or specialized factory tools. But standardization alone could not resurrect a decimated armored column. A mechanic can unbolt a broken engine in an hour, but that speed means absolutely nothing if a replacement engine isn't sitting directly behind him in the mud. Feeding this insatiable appetite for spare parts required a logistical apparatus unlike anything in the history of warfare. As the Allied armies pushed violently across northern Europe, extending their supply lines further and further from the invasion beaches, the U.S. Army implemented a staggering, brute force solution to bridge the gap. They called it the Red Ball Express. It was a relentless, looping highway system carved out of the French countryside, utilizing over 6,000 2.5-ton GMC cargo trucks, running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Driven predominantly by African-American quartermaster troops who pushed themselves to the absolute limits of physical exhaustion. These convoys formed a continuous, rolling conveyor belt of industrial power. They bypassed destroyed bridges, ignored mandated speed limits, and stripped the governors off their engines, driving with their headlights on through the night to ensure that crates of carburetors, suspension bogies, and massive Continental radial engines reached the forward depots. Simultaneously, U.S. Army railway engineers were frantically relaying blown tracks, importing massive American locomotives to drag thousands of tons of heavy armor directly from the coastal ports. But even this monumental effort wasn't enough to satisfy the sheer volume of destruction happening at the front. New parts, straight from the factories in Michigan, took time to arrive. And time was the one currency the Allied commanders did not have. To bridge the final gap, the Ordnance battalions turned to a grim, hyper-efficient practice: cannibalization. Behind the front lines, massive boneyards were established, graveyards of utterly destroyed Sherman tanks. When a tank was hit by a German 88mm shell that completely shattered its hull, the vehicle was dead. But the mechanics didn't see a corpse. They saw a donor. A ruined hull might still hold a perfectly pristine turret, a functioning radio set, or an intact 75mm gun barrel. Working with oxyacetylene torches and heavy wrenches, repair crews ruthlessly stripped the dead machines. They salvaged everything. A heavily damaged tank brought in from the morning's assault would be seamlessly merged with the salvaged tracks, engine, and turret of 3 different tanks destroyed the week prior. They were building Frankenstein Shermans, blending salvaged, scorched steel with freshly unrated parts shipped directly from the coast, welding it all together in the freezing rain and pushing the reconstituted vehicle right back out to the combat commands. This relentless, cyclical flow of resurrected steel was happening entirely out of sight, operating just over the horizon. And because it was completely invisible to the enemy, it was about to fatally compromise the entire German defensive strategy. Deep inside heavily fortified bunkers, German intelligence officers of the Fremde Heere West, Foreign Armies West, were meticulously mapping the destruction of the American armored forces. They were not relying on guesswork. They were compiling daily, highly detailed confirmed kill reports submitted by their frontline panzer commanders and anti-tank gunners. Every burning Sherman was noted, categorized, and cross-referenced. Furthermore, German signals intelligence units were highly adept at intercepting unencrypted American tactical radio traffic. They listened intently to the frantic, static-laced calls for replacement vehicles, identifying the specific radio call signs of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division. The math they were doing seemed absolutely irrefutable. A German intelligence officer could look at the operational strength of an American combat command, confirm through eyewitness reports and radio intercepts that 40 of their 50 tanks had been left as smoldering wrecks in a Belgian valley, and draw the only logical military conclusion. By all accepted standards of armored warfare, that American unit was erased. It was tactically annihilated, stripped of its offensive capability, and effectively removed from the operational board. Believing they had decisively blunted the American Spearhead, German sector commanders confidently reported their defensive success back to high command. Based on these mathematically sound reports, German generals began shifting their precious limited reserves of Tiger and Panther tanks away from these supposedly quiet sectors, reallocating them to patch holes elsewhere in the collapsing front line. They were making critical theater-wide strategic decisions based entirely on an industrial paradigm that the Americans had already rendered completely obsolete. The consequence of this miscalculation hit the German lines like a shockwave. Less than 48 hours after German commanders reported the total destruction of a 3rd Armored Division task force, the fog would clear, and the heavy, rhythmic rumble of hundreds of tank engines would echo across the battlefield once again. German anti-tank gunners, peering through their optics, found themselves staring in absolute disbelief. Advancing toward them through the morning mist were the exact same unit markings, the identical divisional insignias and bumper codes that they had literally shot to pieces 2 days prior. The sheer volume of armor rolling over the hills seemed like a physical impossibility. To the German command, it felt as though the Americans had magically conjured an entirely new armored division out of thin air overnight. They simply could not fathom a supply chain where a destroyed tank was merely considered temporarily offline. The rigidity of the German system was their own cognitive blind spot. In the Wehrmacht, a heavily damaged Tiger tank could not be fixed in a muddy field. It had to be loaded onto a specialized, heavy-duty railway flat car, routed through a rail network constantly being pulverized by Allied bombers, and sent hundreds of miles back into the heart of the Reich to facilities like the Nibelungenwerk factory. There it would be repaired in a pristine industrial environment before facing the arduous journey back to the front weeks or months later. To a German general, a destroyed tank was a permanent subtraction from the daily ledger. To an American ordnance officer, it was an engineering puzzle that could be solved by dawn. The American standardized interchangeable efficiency, operating ruthlessly in the battlefield mud, was fundamentally outmaneuvering the German over-engineered rigidity that required pristine factory conditions. The Germans were fighting a hydra. Every time they severed a steel head, 2 more seemed to roll off the assembly lines and out of the forward repair depots. On paper, this logistical loop was a masterpiece of military efficiency, but a terrifying reality hid behind the statistics. When post-war historians note that the 3rd Armored Division replaced its entire tank fleet multiple times over, the phrasing evokes a sterile administrative maneuver. It conjures images of depleted battalions rotating to the rear, swapping battered vehicles for gleaming lines of fresh Shermans, straight from the assembly plant, and returning to the front as a cohesive, rested fighting force. But for the men on the ground, replacing a division looked nothing like a parade. The American replacement system was not a unified wave. It was a relentless, piecemeal drip. When a company lost 3 tanks in a morning assault against the fortified village, they did not get a cohesive new platoon to replace them. They received 3 individual replacement vehicles, driven up to the line under the cover of darkness, manned by whoever the rear echelon depots had pushed forward that afternoon. The cold, mechanical efficiency of the Ordnance repair battalions had created a grim paradox. The United States Army could patch shattered steel much faster than it could forge experienced veteran crews. To fill the empty seats in these resurrected machines, the supply chain funneled a steady stream of individual replacements directly into the active combat zones. These were often teenagers, freshly drafted, given accelerated armored training stateside, and then fed individually into frontline units that had already been hollowed out by attrition. They arrived in the European mud disoriented, exhausted, and terrified, forced to immediately integrate into tight-knit veteran tank crews, where they didn't even know the names of the men sitting 3 feet away from them. But the ultimate psychological blow came when these young men were ordered to climb into their assigned vehicles. The maintenance battalions were incredibly fast, but they were not performing cosmetic restorations. They were returning functional weapons of war to the line as quickly as physics allowed. When a replacement gunner or driver lowered himself through the hatch of a newly delivered Sherman, the history of the machine was inescapably obvious. Right beside their head, they would see the fresh, unpainted weld marks of a steel plug, sealing the exact hole where a German high-velocity round had violently penetrated the hull days earlier. They were climbing into dead men's tanks. The ordnance crews did their best to clean the interiors, but the smell of burnt cordite, scorched paint, and raw bleach often lingered in the cramped, poorly lit turrets. Hastily scrubbed, dark stains on the canvas seats or a deeply gouged instrument panel offered a silent, terrifying testament to the fate of the previous occupant. The American logistical Leviathan had solved the mathematical puzzle of the battlefield, but it had created a devastating, hidden morale crisis. It was a system that treated human beings as interchangeable components within an indestructible industrial machine, demanding that terrified young men repeatedly drive patched-up steel vehicles back into the sights of superior German guns. And this grim, relentless cycle of regenerated machines and expendable men was about to face its absolute breaking point in the freezing, fog-shrouded winter of 1944. When the Wehrmacht launched its massive, final counteroffensive through the frozen Ardennes forest on December 16, 1944, the American logistical Leviathan faced its ultimate trial by fire. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a strategic ambush. It was a brutal, physical stress test of a supply chain that had already been stretched to its absolute limits. The 3rd Armored Division was violently thrown into the northern shoulder of the salient, ordered to blunt the advance of elite, desperate panzer armies. The conditions were apocalyptic. In sub-zero temperatures, the ground froze solid, turning the rolling Belgian hills into treacherous sheets of ice. U.S. tankers found themselves locked in close-quarters combat among dense pine forests and snowbound villages, facing heavy German armor that possessed wider tracks, better traction, and devastating high-velocity firepower. The attrition was horrific. Shermans were frequently ambushed on narrow logging roads, their thin armor pierced by concealed anti-tank guns before the crews even saw the muzzle flash. But it was directly behind the lines where the true battle for survival was fought. The severe cold snapped steel track pins and froze engines solid overnight. Ordnance mechanics were forced to work in the open, using blowtorches just to thaw their heavy wrenches before they could unbolt shattered transmissions from frozen tank hulls. Recovery crews dragged destroyed vehicles out of the snowdrifts under heavy mortar fire, their bare hands sticking to the freezing metal of their M32 recovery rigs. Based on the sheer volume of burning American armor littering the Ardennes, German commanders were certain the Spearhead division was finally disintegrating. The math of destruction was reaching a catastrophic peak. Over the course of the war, the 3rd Armored Division would lose well over 600 medium tanks in combat. That figure represented a staggering turnover rate of nearly 300% of its authorized vehicle strength. To put that into perspective, the division absorbed hardware losses that would have permanently erased 3 entire German panzer divisions from the operational map. By all traditional military logic, sustaining that level of kinetic trauma should have forced the 3rd Armored to withdraw entirely, pulling back to a rear staging area for months of total operational reconstitution. But the American machine did not pause. Even in blinding snowstorms, when supply planes were grounded and roads were considered impassable, the pipeline kept grinding forward. Replacement parts, salvaged turrets, and terrified new crews continued to flow into the frozen encampments. As fast as the Wehrmacht could hollow out the division, the mechanics and quartermasters ruthlessly stitched it back together. When the skies finally cleared and the Allied counterattack began, the German High Command was met with a terrifying reality. The American armored formations that had just absorbed the deadliest winter offensive of the Western Front simply shifted gears and drove east. There was no strategic pause. There was no withdrawal to the French coast to rebuild. Instead, the freshly reconstituted 3rd Armored Division became the tip of the spear that pierced the Siegfried Line and ground its way directly into the heart of Germany. Pushing relentlessly through the thawing mud of early spring, they absorbed even more losses, yet their forward momentum never broke. By March 1945, the division had reached the banks of the Rhine, spearheading the massive urban assault that captured the industrial city of Cologne. As German officers looked out over the ruins of the city, watching endless columns of Shermans rolling past the shattered spires of the Cologne Cathedral, they were left in a state of absolute strategic bewilderment. The division occupying their city had been mathematically destroyed multiple times over. The enemy command could not comprehend how an army could bleed so heavily, lose so much steel, and yet never stop attacking, leaving them completely blind to the true nature of the invisible, relentless machine that had actually engineered their defeat. Those perplexed German intelligence officers, staring at their meticulously confirmed kill reports in the winter of 1944, were looking at the wrong battlefield. When they tallied the smoking hulls of American tanks left across northern Europe, they believed they were fighting a traditional war of clashing armor, where the superior machine and the elite crew dictated the victor. They never realized they were actually fighting a ruthless, grinding war of mechanics. The legend of the indestructible American Armored Division, the phantom force that seemed to absorb catastrophic punishment only to attack again the next morning, was not simply a product of pristine assembly lines in Michigan, churning out an endless wave of fresh replacements. The United States did not win the armored campaign in Western Europe merely because it manufactured more tanks in the safety of the homeland. It won because it mastered the gritty, unsentimental science of keeping those tanks moving 4,000 miles away from the factory floor. The myth of the heroic, unstoppable combat division was, in truth, forged by grease-covered logisticians working with blowtorches under canvas tarps in the freezing mud. It was built by the terrifying bravery of recovery crews dragging dead steel out of active kill zones, by the sheer exhaustion of truck drivers stripping engine governors to deliver carburetors through the night, and by an engineering doctrine that prioritized interchangeable parts over battlefield invulnerability. The German High Command, completely obsessed with the bespoke technological supremacy of their heavy, over-engineered panzers, could not grasp the devastating power of this unglamorous reality. They saw armored warfare as a rigid contest of individual duels, where a destroyed tank was a permanent operational casualty, to be painstakingly rebuilt in a distant factory. The Americans treated armored warfare as an industrial supply chain that just happened to terminate at the barrel of a 75mm gun. This realization fundamentally changes how we view the technological history of the conflict. The true marvel of the Allied war machine was not the design of the Sherman tank itself, but the vast, decentralized network of maintenance battalions, salvage yards, and forward supply depots that kept it breathing. The American military had solved the ultimate equation of attrition, revealing that the decisive factor in modern warfare was not merely producing the heaviest armor, but building the invisible, relentless mechanisms required to sustain it. In the end, the fatal blind spot of the German High Command was a fundamental failure of military philosophy, as the Third Reich squandered its dwindling industrial resources trying to engineer the single, unassailable, perfect weapon of war. The United States chose the exact opposite path, willingly accepting the inherent vulnerabilities of the M4 Sherman on the battlefield and focusing its vast industrial power on engineering the perfect logistical system required to keep an imperfect machine fighting forever. It was this relentless, unglamorous apparatus of standardization, salvage, and forward maintenance, operating in the freezing mud just out of reach of enemy guns, that ultimately crushed the German war machine and redefined the reality of mechanized warfare for the rest of the 20th century.